what we're talking about is an anti-rational worldview, that it sees rationality itself as Western, patriarchal, something to be demonized. I mean, that to me seems at the heart of a lot of this.
That is their language, and they will say that mathematics is racist, that science is racist, that objectivity is a function of white privilege. And yet, on the other hand, I'm always reluctant to use the usual conservative argument, say, well, it's anti-common sense or anti-reason, because I'm not sure they would cop to saying, well, I'm against common sense. Like, I think this is commonsensical, but I'm against it, or I'm not using my reason here. I think we have
well,
to.
They're not
we
that
can't
dumb.
we can't just charge them with wrong procedures. I think we have to get to the empirical claims that are being made.
Hey there, folks. Welcome to Socrates in the Studio. I am thrilled to have as my guest someone who identifies as Heather McDonald. Heather, welcome.
Yes, you're assiduously gender neutral on that.
I want to be very, very clear. That's how you identify, and I respect that. And the pronoun I'm going to use is you.
No.
You.
Please.
You singular, you people, or use for the plural.
I don't usually identify particularly female, but in this case I will.
Okay, thank you.
But I certainly don't identify as male.
Well, look, Heather, you have written many books. The new book, which I've read recently, is called When Race Trumps Merit: How the Pursuit of Equity Sacrifices Excellence, Destroys Beauty, and Threatens Lives. Unfortunately, quite literally, when you read the book, that becomes clear. I want to talk to you about the ideas in this book and the ideas in the diversity delusion. The problem is, where do we start?
Well, we can start with some recent news that the FAA is considering diversity, making race and gender a qualification for doing air traffic control, which is showing that the diversity cult is now a death cult.
Well, we already knew that. This is just a new level of death.
Yeah, right. It's the
like
death
mass
in the air.
death from the skies.
Exactly.
Right.
Not just the death of standards, but the death on the roads. We're going to get that as well, and we're also going to get death in the emergency rooms.
Okay. When just to begin this, as broadly as possible, state up front the thesis of the book, so that I don't have to.
The thesis is that there is a dominant narrative in our society today that is threatening Western civilization. And that narrative says that any racial disparities in any institution is by definition a product of racism. No other explanations are allowed into the public discourse. So let me give you some examples. If a medical school doesn't have 13% Black students or Black faculty, 13% being the population of Blacks in the nation at large, that is by definition a racist medical school. The reason there's an underrepresentation of Blacks is racism. If a big tech company doesn't have 13% Black nanotechnologists or computer scientists, that is a racist tech company. And it works in the other direction for overrepresentation. If Blacks are more than 13% of the prison population, they're actually a third nationally. That's because we have a racist criminal justice system. And the solution to these racial disparities is to tear down any standard that is resulting in the underrepresentation of Blacks in meritocratic institutions. So let's say a hiring exam or a skills test, or in the case of the criminal law, tearing down the criminal law itself if that results in putting more than 13% Blacks in prison. What you're not allowed to say is, well, actually, there's an academic skills gap which we should think about and worry about that results in the underrepresentation. And there's a criminal offending gap, which is really difficult to talk about, which results in overrepresentation. And tearing down these standards is hurtling us very fast towards, at best, mediocrity, and at worst,
Extinction.
Real extinction.
Civilizational
extinction of excellence
extinction.
and civilizational extinction.
Well, I think that says it all. We're done here. First of all, I want to say that the level of preposterousness of much of what you write about in the book, When Race Trumps Merit, is such that it is often comedic. In other words, it's entertaining on some level because it is so wildly preposterous, and it begins to eat, it's the snake eating its tail, where, in other words, it gets to a point where what you just said about air traffic controllers, because the standard thing would be to say, like, look, I don't need to agree with the theology of my pilot or with the politics of my pilot. I want him to be a good pilot because I don't want to die. That's his job. Right. The idea that, it's one thing for this craziness, to creep into, humanities at places like Yale, where both of us have the fortune and misfortune of having spent time. That's sort of at least understandable. But when you're talking about medical schools, when you're talking about air traffic controllers, it's hard to process that people are, I guess the way I always phrase it is that I'm on team reality, right? Like, I care about reality. But these folks, it seems to me, and this is not to get too wiggy, but they don't seem to believe in reality. Everything's a social construct, or everything is in their head. They don't seem to even believe in the idea of metrics or numbers or whatever. They're just in the ether, 100% in the ether. That's the only way I can process that they would have these opinions.
Well, I think they would say we have a very strong understanding of reality, which is the reality of America is endemically white supremacist.
Yeah.
And
that's why we'll never elect a black president, much less for 2 terms.
Exactly. Not
it's
possible.
It's not going to happen.
And no Republicans have had love affairs with black politicians like, Alan Keyes or Alan West or Colin Powell or Condoleezza Rice. Impossible. Will not happen.
Right. They're way too racist ever to embrace somebody like Clarence Thomas.
Exactly.
That'll never happen.
No.
Well, so we have to joke because it's madness.
Yeah, and I have to say, you and I can say, I told you so, because we've been warning about the insanity on campuses for 30 years, 40 years, and everybody's laughed it off. You'd write these articles, say, look at, back in the early 1990s, you'd had freshman orientation segregated by race, or dorm segregated, graduation ceremonies segregated by race, on the theory that integration was somehow psychologically injurious to black students. And people said, let these people graduate into the real world. They'll toughen up and they'll see that there's competitive standards and merit and accomplishment matters. And in fact, it was the students, the products of this hate-filled university, that changed reality in their image. And
right, the university finally bled over into the quote-unquote real world and made it not real.
Exactly. As Andrew Sullivan said, we're all on campus now. And after George Floyd, the mass psychosis that followed the race riots, this idea that racism defines American reality and explains everything that we see about our institutional structures became absolutely ubiquitous. And you had our most elite institutions preposterously blaming themselves and blaming everybody else for phantom racism.
Although, as I say in reading the book, that's to me where some of the best comedy comes in, when you find these people that are just way out there in the progressive world, who are doing the self-flagellation, the mea culpas, as though they have always been Klan members, and thank you for revealing this to me. There's comedy to me in that, and this goes way beyond the race issue. On the trans stuff or whatever, it begins to eat itself, because it becomes, when you talk about the Floyd stuff, we saw it with the Me Too movement. A kind of madness takes over. Reason is jettisoned because something, I don't know what the something is, but it's like, so we've arrived at a point where we can jettison reason, and we just have to believe every woman. We have to see systemic racism everywhere. And to some extent, I don't know if it's the hermeneutic lever, but what we're talking about is an anti-rational worldview, that it sees rationality itself as Western, patriarchal, something to be demonized. I mean, that to me seems at the heart of a lot of this.
And you're absolutely right that is their language. And they will say that mathematics is racist, that science is racist, that objectivity is a function of white privilege. And yet, on the other hand, I'm always reluctant to use the usual conservative argument, say, well, it's anti-common sense or anti-reason, because I'm not sure they would cop to saying, well, I'm against common sense. Like, I think this is commonsensical, but I'm against it, or I'm not using my reason here. I think we have
well,
to.
They're not
we
that
can't
dumb.
we can't just charge them with wrong procedures. I think we have to get to the empirical claims that are being made, and so the trans thing is like in a class by itself. That is truly bizarre. But on the other things, they would still argue that they have evidence on their side. And so that's why it's very important to provide alternative explanations for why we have these disparities.
Well, your book, and this is why you're you and I'm me, but you have the talent to write a book loaded with evidence to support this in all these spheres, and one is more entertaining than the other. You start with medicine and science, then you get into the culture, and then finally into the law. But some of it, as I say, is just comedic. I mean, when I read your chapter about the French, the 19th century French bust.
Oh. I'm glad you thought it was funny. To me, like, I was enraged. That was very hard to write.
It is both.
Yeah,
like,
I know.
It is beyond enraging.
It's
I mean, I went to the Metropolitan website, I live near the Metropolitan Museum here in the city in New York. And I just thought, let me see what they say. First of all, let me see what the bust looks like, and let me see what they say about it. And you just want to do backflips with rage of, you can't believe.
I know.
And so nobody knows what we're talking about. So do everyone a favor and describe what we're talking about. We're now talking about the world of art.
Yes.
We're talking about the Met here in New York. But talk about this, the two acquisitions, the terracotta and the marble original. Just talk about this, because to me, it sums up in some ways everything you say in the book.
Yeah, let me back up. This is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is one of the great encyclopedic museums in the world, that has been given the privilege, its director, Max Holein, has been given the privilege of curating a collection that was created over a century by these wealthy, generous donors who gave him works from across the world, and they are beautiful. And all we ask of Max Holein and his curators is one thing: tell the public why they should be grateful to be able to see these works, and why they are brilliant, and why they expand our knowledge of human experience and how to see the world. That's all we ask. It's a really good job. So there was a 19th century French sculptor named Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux, and he's probably the second greatest French sculptor after Rodin. And if anybody has ever seen the works of Bernini in Rome at the Borghese Gallery, Bernini has this amazing capacity to show flesh on flesh, the pressure of a satyr's hand on a nymph's arm as he's taking away, in marble.
In marble.
Carpeaux achieves very, very close to that. He's a brilliant sculptor. He was absolutely central to the renovation of Paris in the late 19th century, the creation of the grand boulevards under Haussmann and public monuments. He did a wonderful frieze for the Paris Opera. He created a bust in the 1860s, or 1873 actually, called Why Born Enslaved?
Clearly, he created this beautiful sculpture as an abolitionist statement.
Exactly.
In art.
Exactly.
Clearly.
Exactly.
Okay.
His goal was to move the viewer if the viewer needed prodding to understand the inhumanity of slavery. So it's an African woman with a rope around her chest. One of her breasts is bare, which is typical for all sculpture at the period. It is not voyeuristic or sensational. And she's looking over her shoulder with the most poignant, piercing expression of dismay, just defiance, lack of understanding what is going on. And as you say, it's patently a work with an abolitionist message.
But even if you didn't look at it, we just know that we know historically that is absolutely why he created this.
Exactly.
Like, we know that as a fact.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the Metropolitan Opera first bought a terracotta version of this in the 90s, and it had, in the 2014, it had a whole show around Carpeaux. It was a fantastic retrospective. I was fortunate enough to go, not knowing that I would be writing about him in another 7 years or so. And it shows, it's this wonderful benchmark of the Met in 2014, pre-George Floyd mass psychosis,
Right.
and the Met in 2022. So in 2014, it could say Carpeaux is a fantastic sculptor. This is the terracotta version of Why Born Enslaved. Fantastic work, poignant, moves the viewer. So then the Met gets a new curator of its sculpture, European sculpture department, and George Floyd happens, and they decide, okay, we're gonna buy the marble bust, and we're gonna do an entirely different show that will correct the blindness and the racism of our 2014 show. And so they build an entire show around the marble bust, which is a much more elegant and finished version of this. And the show is called The Fictions of Emancipation. This already is a clue. So emancipation is a fiction. It never happened. And the thesis of the Met's show of 2022, The Fictions of Emancipation, is that because Carpeaux was a white sculptor, in him creating an ostensibly abolitionist work, actually the purpose of that work was to argue that blacks are inherently slaves and will always be so. And that it was actually not an abolitionist work, but was in favor of the enslavement of blacks. And every other abolitionist work, like Josiah Wedgewood, who was a British, had a porcelain factory, though we all know the Wedgewood, lines of tableware. He did a famous medallion called "Am I Not a Man and a Brother?" of a black man with chains begging for recognition of his humanity. Wedgewood campaigned against slavery. The Met's thesis in Fictions of Emancipation is Wedgewood was a racist.
Okay, I knew about the Wedgewood art because I wrote a biography of William Wilberforce, the white guy who led the battle for the abolition of the slave trade, and he partnered with people like Wedgewood and others to use the arts and culture to help people understand the wickedness of the slave trade. So there's no doubt that Josiah Wedgewood created that image, which was widely disseminated for the very purpose of ending the slave trade and ultimately slavery, and was in fact very successful in that. There's no doubt about that. That's historical. That's the record. But the Met perversely decides somehow, against all facts. I mean, there are no facts.
Right.
It's just they impose this crazy subjective view on the bust to which you were referring, the sculpture, and then on Wedgewood, which is even a more dramatically clear example of somebody using his gifts to free blacks from slavery. And that is nonetheless called racist. There's no way out of that conundrum, the paradox that they're basically saying that no matter what a white person does, even when advocating for black people as fully human, as people who should not be enslaved, even in that act, you're being racist. And you just think you have to hold your head. Because they're saying this today at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and across institutions throughout the West. They're doing this, but they don't have, and we know this, they have absolutely nothing to back up that position.
The catalog copy, which I wrote about, it's exclusively academic jargon theory. It is they mindlessly vomit forth the usual phrases from academic deconstruction, feminist theory, anti-colonial theory, and they think by endlessly repeating, intersectional themes of the enslavement of the black body and whatnot, that they have made an argument. You're absolutely right. In this case, I'll concede it. They do not have facts. They do not have reason. But yes, your viewers should understand, Eric, the degree of hatred that went into the creation of this show. Self-hatred, but also hatred for what Max Holein and his curators believe is the unwashed masses, that they hate Western art now, they hate our civilization, and they will engage in the most counterfactual narratives to continue this amazingly counterfactual discourse. And it involves, in making their argument about the Carpeaux bust, they have to turn on every aspect of Western art. So, yes, one of her breasts is revealed.
You mean turn against?
Turn against.
Well, no, I mean, you said it correctly, but just to be clear, they are, yes, they go ahead.
They have to take some of the most long-standing and noble traditions within Western art and argue that those are racist in order to try and argue that this bust is racist. So, for example, yes, one of the sitters' breasts is revealed. Well, so is the famous Delacroix portrait of the French Revolution of liberty.
I believe both busts are,
both breasts in that case.
Yeah.
And the nude, there have been millions of nudes created. 99.999% of those nudes have been white. There have been very few black nudes, but somehow, because this one model is black and one breast is exposed, this means that the portrayal of the nude is racist.
Well, as far as they're concerned, everything is the Hottentot Venus. There's just nothing else to discuss. It must be because
of voyeurism,
she's black, and that's the end of it, and we don't need to talk anymore. And it's obviously silly. But what's creepy, Heather, is the seriousness with which they take themselves. In other words, these are like, it's like being in Mao's Cultural Revolution.
Yes.
You cannot have any real conversations.
True.
You are guilty, and you must say that you're guilty.
Right.
What do you think accounts, this is broader than the subject of your book, but because you back it up so magnificently in so many fields, what do you think accounts for the hatred among the elites in the West of the West, of our civilization? And it does seem to be only the elites, only the people running places like the Met or Yale or whatever. They somehow feel that this is their version of noblesse oblige, that they have to do this mea culpa, self-flagellation on behalf of everyone because they're in the lead. But what might account for their, let's call it self-hatred, or the hatred of the greatness of the West?